Our third presenter is a theologian. So now we have a nice buffet of scholars. So sociologists, anthropologists. Now we've got a theologian. Um, in Father Jose Mario Francisco, who is a professor of philosophical and systematic theology and former president of the Loyola School of Theology here at the Ateneo. Father Mario?
Magandang hapon. Yung aking sasabihin para sa lahat ng mga Katoliko sarado. Many do not think twice about referring to the Philippines as Catholic nation because of Christianity's overwhelming majority and presence. We find such references in media reports, Rappler, textbooks, academic essays, etc. I propose that we pause before using it. We must first be aware of the origins and consequences, direct or hidden, in its use. We must also recognize that contemporary Southeast Asia is similarly characterized by demographic and social dominance of particular religions. Islam constitutes a majority in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei, Buddhism in Thailand, Myanmar, and Cambodia, and Laos, and Christianity, of course, in the Philippines and Timor-Leste. At the same time, we bear in mind that these majorities are not monolithic, and the constitutional status of these religions differs in each nation state. Given this, I examined the use of Catholic nation in the official collective discourse of Philippine Catholic bishops on nationalism and the nation. So it's a textual focus. Though through their statements, church leaders aim to explain Christian belief, to point to matters of concern within church or society, and to propose paths for further reflection and action. My analysis of this discourse begins with Benedict Anderson's insight on nation as an imagined political community and applies it to both the national and the religious collective. Reading the bishop's statements hence uncovers the imaginary of the Philippines both as Catholic and as Filipino. I discuss this imaginary's construction, its use before and after the profound impact of the Second Vatican Council and the Marcos authoritarian regime, its underlying presuppositions, and if I have time, its prospects in a global situation. First, construction and promotion of the imaginary. The identification of nation and religious community occurs in other historical instances and appears to be an ever-present impulse in Christianity. After all, Christianity traces its ancestry to the Jews as God's people, an identification popularized by Vatican II's description of the Church as a pilgrim people. Moreover, in the Philippine case, unlike in the European, this conflation of the body politic and the body Catholic was made possible through a singular yet complex historical process from the 16th century entry of colonization. The same geographical and linguistic infrastructures introduced by colonial and missionary establishments provided the basis for this conflation and therefore the imaginary of Catholic nation. Barangays based on kinship, alliance, and trade were now organized within the juridical agreement of the papacy and Spanish monarchy. Native baybayin was transformed into the Roman alphabet, and literacy, which Anderson sees as crucial to the development of nation, was linked to religious teaching, best exemplified by the Caton, a pamphlet using Christian prayers to teach the new alphabet. It is not surprising then that official Catholic discourse conflated the body Catholic and the body politic in terms of its God-given role in non-Christian Asia. Its 25 January 1953 statement tells the Filipino nation that you are a Catholic people and as such are determined to live and die, and contrasts it to ancient and once Christian nations stricken with paralysis by domestic strife, even while the massed forces of evil rise like a mighty sea against their borders. Its 2nd February 1964 letter further employs this imaginary as the only Christian nation in the Orient as basis for its singular responsibility for mission. This imaginary was specially promoted on special occasions, among them the Holy Year 1950-51, Marian Year 1964, and the Second Eucharistic Congress 1956, as well as other patronal feasts and religious assemblies. Symbolic rituals on these occasions underscored the imaginary, as at the 1954 Second National Eucharistic Congress, President Philippine President Ramon Magsaysay dedicated the nation to the Sacred Heart. Now, to the uses of the imaginary. First, as defense against independent nationalism. The imaginary was first used as a defense against forms of nationalism perceived to be a threat by the official group of Philippine bishops before Vatican II. This group, called the Catholic Welfare Organization, CWO, issued 7 statements in the wake of popular nationalist sentiment as well as fundamental debates over Filipino nationhood after the 1946 Declaration of Philippine Independence. The official church response to these nationalists was understandably guarded and offensive and defensive, given the collateral damage on the Catholic Church of both Spanish and American colonization. In the Church's recent memory, American occupation brought thorny issues and negotiations after Spanish defeat, as well as long-term and profound social change through the separation of church and state, the entry of American popular culture, the activities of the Iglesia Filipino Independiente, and Protestant churches and organizations. As education is essential to the Church's mission of passing on its faith, and under the circumstances of American occupation, also important for its continuing role in Philippine society, education became the battleground for the Church's defense against those it referred to as Masons, communists, and advocates of a false liberalism. The 3 fronts in this battle involve first, voluntary religious instruction during class hours in public schools by willing public school or catechist teachers. 2, nationalization of school boards, heads, and faculty in social sciences. And 3rd, inclusion of nationalist publication like Rizal's novels in the general curriculum. For example, the CWO's 28 January 1959 statement argued against nationalization by pointing to professional training rather than ethnic origin as basis for the educator's competence and impartiality. In its attack on including Rizal's unexpurgated novels in the general curriculum, the 24th April 1956 statement insists, and I quote, that we, the Philippine Catholic hierarchy, cannot permit the eternal salvation of immortal souls, souls for which we are answerable before the throne of divine justice, to be compromised. Now, its second use as platform for social engagement. The imaginary of Catholic nation became a platform for social engagement in CBCP statements because of the changed historical situation in the Church, Vatican II, and Philippine society, martial law from 1967 onward. These texts employ the imaginary to, and I quote, to read the signs of the times in the light of the gospel. Statements on specific issues such as human rights, human rights violation of 43 Morong Bataan health workers, the value-added tax, or the workers' plight at the Aquino-owned Hacienda Luisita, but most especially in three central comprehensive texts on Philippine politics, 1997, the economy, 1998, and culture, 1999, all illustrate this. They usually assess the situation, evaluate it in the light of the integral gospel and human development, and propose paths for reflection and action. Through this pastoral logic, national concerns are read as signs of the times within the imaginary of the Philippines as Catholic nation. For example, the text on economics, or I'll use the political text, would talk about the importance of voting, voting as a Christian responsibility, and so forth, and then say Philippine politics is dirty, you have vote buying, and so on and so forth. Therefore, you should not sell your vote, you should join NAMFREL, PPCRB, and so on. Now, what are the underlying principles behind this imaginary? Further critical analysis points to two presuppositions embedded in official discourse and therefore behind the imaginary. First, the implicit church account of the link between evangelization and colonization, and second, the pastoral logic governing concrete social involvement. First, all the church statements created and promoted the imaginary through a distorted account of the links between evangelization and colonization. For example, the CBCP statement for the fourth centenary of evangelization asserts that, and I quote, "As Catholics, the year 1565 is sacred to us, for that was the year when the preaching of the gospel in these islands began in earnest. As Filipinos, that year is also of great significance to us because that was the year when the Philippines as a nation came into being. As the gospel was brought from one island to another, the Philippines as a country, as one nation emerged." Such an account does not only deny the continuous thread of particular instances and organized movements of native resistance, but glosses over discrimination, exploitation, and violence perpetuated by both ecclesiastical and colonial authorities. Only on the centennial of Philippine independence would the bishop's official discourse acknowledge this by, and I quote, "apologizing for the ambiguous stand some church people held during the revolution, which partly explains the rise of the religious revolution." End of quote. Here, the word ambiguous fails to capture the entanglement of the church and its personnel in the colonial enterprise. Furthermore, this distorted account contributed to and even legitimized the marginalization of non-Catholic Filipinos. Given its perspective and the then existing competition and even animosity between the Protestants and the dominant Catholics, the CWO was oblivious of any religious basis for ecumenism and thus thought of nothing of appropriating the name Christian for itself. This practical marginalization extends to Filipinos from no or other religious traditions, especially the significant Muslim majority with its long history of resistance against ways of colonization. Second, the pastoral logic of reading the signs of the times in the light of the gospel is inadequately applied. As illustrated in the three general statements, it emphasizes the religious foundation of the Catholic nation at work in social development and makes possible the application of religious and moral principles on particular issues. Thus, it moves one way from religious principle to application and is deductive in nature. As a consequence, it often leads to a presumed a priori conflation of what is Catholic with what is the common good, with what is Filipino. The Church's insistence on integral human development recognizes that the concept of common good basic to governance and civil society is a path accessible to all, especially when it is accused of imposing Catholic beliefs on non-Catholics. And yet, many of the statements, such as those on the RH bill, make it appear that the CBCP position is the only conclusion that these principles lead to. Furthermore, this unidirectional and deductive logic is linked to the clear boundaries the CBCP draws between, quote, the moral dimension, its avowed focus in social involvement, and the technical aspects which it consigns as properly belonging to the laity. However, these boundaries are not easily marked or closed. Thus, the bishops' assessments in their statements must be allowed to draw from non-church sources and to interact with, even interrogate, the very principles that are the basis of pastoral exhortation and action. On both theoretical and practical grounds, then, tension between Catholic and nation is endemic and unavoidable. In the words of Assad, appeal to the moral aspects of social concerns is not the exclusive domain of religion in the secular nation state, because it is itself a complex arrangement of legal reasoning, moral practice, and political authority. 2 minutes. Last, the prospects of the imaginary in the global world. What are the current challenges if we are to rethink, if the church wants to rethink this imaginary of Catholic nation? First, it must do so not on the basis of an uncritical account of Christianity's history in the Philippines or function solely on a deductive pastoral logic. Second, the church's recreation of the imaginary would have to take place within and in recognition of the public domain, the space which Assad says we now retrospectively call the social, that is, the all-inclusive secular space that we distinguish conceptually from variables like religion, the state, and the national economy. After all, as he says, the categories of politics and religion turn out to implicate each other more profoundly than we thought. The concept of the secular cannot do without the idea of religion. So there will always be that tension. Third, what is bound to have greater impact on the recreation of the imaginary is how multiple forms of globalization create new configurations of space and time, and therefore new forms of community, such as in social media. Given these extensive and profound changes, the relation between the body politic and the body Catholic may call for imaginaries similarly radical. Just as geographical space-time coordinates constituted religious community and nation, creating the imaginary of Catholic nation, these new configurations will now undoubtedly shape the nature of religious community and the nation, and thus challenge the Catholic Church in rethinking the imaginary of the Philippines as Catholic nation. I hope that all this has convinced you to think more than twice before referring to the Philippines as Catholic nation. Salamat po.
Well, I am definitely convinced, but maybe you were preaching to me as a member of the choir. Thank you for that super provocative and reflective essay, Father Mario. Our last presentation is going to be delivered by Dr. Julius Bautista, who is currently a senior lecturer in the Southeast Asian Studies program at the National University of Singapore. He flew in just for this. And he will be taking up a new post as associate professor at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University. It's time now to take a look at the gory experience of doing ethnography. Dr. Bautista.
Good afternoon. Actually, mahirap din sundan yung paper ni Father Mario eh. But I'll try nevertheless. Una sa lahat, thank you to Jail for nasingit pa ako sa program. Actually, hindi naman dapat ako kasama eh. As you see from the previously circulated program, I'm not included. But, you know, I decided at the very end, a few days ago, that I would just invite myself to this particular gathering because the people who are part of this volume are really the people that you would think of as being on the cutting edge of thinking about Filipino Catholicism. And it is a great honor for myself to write an article with my good friend Peter Brownline and have that included in the volume that I'm hoping you will all purchase if you haven't done so already. At saka thank you na rin kay Prof. June because nasingit pa yung review ng aking libro sa volume this volume. So I'm very glad to have been part of that privilege as well. I'm going to talk to you today about a paper that's called The Act of Witnessing, or an act of witnessing, doing fieldwork on passion rituals in the Philippines. I wrote this paper with Professor Peter Brownline. And this began as just a conversation between the two of us. We were just really comparing notes when he happened to visit Singapore one day. But more than just a simple comparison of notes, that led into a conversation of something more profound, relating to the way in which fieldwork is conducted in Filipino Catholicism. We were reflecting on it from different generational and cultural perspectives. But that led to us interrogating the very methods which we use in order to learn and understand topics to do with Filipino Catholicism. And what we decided was we need to move beyond the assumptions that we as anthropologists have been trained to internalize. What that conversation led to was us interrogating what it is that we take in to the field when we actually try to interrogate Filipino Catholicism. And I'd like to share with you today two aspects of that conversation. In the meantime, I'm going to share with you some photographs of my own fieldwork in Pampanga. Now, this is just pretty randomized, actually. I don't think that I'll necessarily speak about each photograph, or maybe if we have time later on, maybe I'll talk a little bit more specifically about that. But as I said, I'd like to just talk about two things about the paper that I've written to hopefully convey to you the sense of where that conversation with Professor Brownline went and what it meant to us as anthropologists doing research on Filipino Catholicism from different cultural backgrounds and different generational backgrounds. So let's just have that playing on the loop while I talk to you about these 2 points. The first point is this. It's time that we confront the professional hubris that we as anthropologists have in engaging with topics of Filipino Catholicism. And that hubris is that the success or the failure of our ethnographic endeavors depends on how well we can deploy our research design. In other words, an effective anthropological enterprise has a lot to do with the assumption that the anthropologist is the determinant of the parameters of ethnographic research. That it is we who determine the fruitfulness of the pursuit of anthropological knowledge. Now, Peter and I, even if we come from different generational backgrounds, were, in the end, unsatisfied with these assumptions, which led us to think about the conditions in which we as anthropologists have been trained to internalize. And what we found was that there is an incongruity between the way we were trained as anthropologists, and the contradictions, the vagaries, the contingencies, and the inconsistencies of the anthropological present. If I may read from the article, in our experience, the researcher is not the sovereign determinant of the parameters of the anthropological encounter. Doing fieldwork is a fluid process in an often unpredictable socio-cultural milieu, whereby ethnographic authority is not possessed solely by he who initiates the business of data gathering. Those we have encountered in our respective intrusions into the lives of our interlocutors have hardly ever sat in passive amenability to our ethnographic directives. Rather, they have been consistently assertive in directing us to fulfill certain roles in accordance with their priorities, often in ways that have challenged our own sense of what participant observation and the act of witnessing can and should entail. In other words, we decided that in many ways our research activity was determined by the frustration of our research agenda. The success, or so we'd like to think, or the fruitfulness of our anthropological enterprise had a lot to do with being responsive to the vagaries of the field, rather than being able to manipulate the conditions in which we do research. So that's the first point. It's, as Jail had mentioned earlier, it's a methodological point to do with the empirical conditions under which we conduct research in Filipino Catholicism, on Filipino Catholicism, rather than a particular kind of substantive point. Maybe I'll stop and talk about the photographs. Here I am at the Starbucks, of course, where a lot of fieldwork happens, with the directors of the Via Crucis, the director and the man who plays Jesus himself. When I was asked to do research, I was entrusted to this person here. Sabi nila, ikaw nang bahala dyan kay Julius. You determine how where he comes in, what he does, and so on and so forth. And when I got there, basically people pretty much just thought I was a priest, to be honest. And they said things like, "Oy, Father, salamat naman at umattend din kayo sa sa pasyon." Because normally they don't get any parish priests joining these rituals. So in a way, I was also assumed to be performing particular kind of roles, even though those roles weren't necessarily accurate. So here he is, telling me what to do, but he decided, okay, diyan ka muna, Julius, bibili muna ako ng sigarilyo. So there he is buying cigarettes. Meanwhile, I'm there totally at the whim of my interlocutor. So much for my own research design. Okay? So that's the first point. The first point is about the positionality with which we can affect the effectiveness of our research agendas. The second point I want to make has a lot to do, or has to do, with what I've described as the vagaries and contradictions of the act of witnessing. For different reasons, both Peter and I were given opportunities in our fieldwork, which on the surface would seem to be the most ideal circumstances in which to achieve ethnographic accuracy. That is, to be nailed on the cross, or to perform certain roles in the play, in the performance of the Passion Play. Siguro, na-frustrate na rin sila because we were asking so many questions about crucifixion. So many questions about what it feels like to be nailed, what it's like to be up on the cross. Eventually, they probably said, look, if you really want to know what this is about, why don't you have yourself crucified? Why don't you yourself experience it firsthand if you want to achieve this ideal of ethnographic accuracy? Okay, and to be honest, I was tempted. I thought, hey, why not, right? They said, look, you're a young man. I'm sure you can. You're healthy enough. I'll even do it for you. Sabi ni director, I'll even do the nailing for you. Don't worry, you'll be fine. Okay. leave that till later. You'll have to read the article. Basahin nyo na lang yung article. No, actually, both Peter and I were offered the same prospect. He had different reasons for being offered crucifixion. But in the end, we both declined that invitation. We both declined, right? And that was not necessarily because of certain aversion to pain or a certain kind of, it's not that we didn't really were intimidated by the physical aspects of crucifixion, but it really had to do with the idea of empiricism itself. And if you allow me to read once again from the article, yes, my crucifixion would enable me to experience the ritual at the level of sensation, of the nails driving through my palms, of the sun scorching my body, of the sounds of the crowd witnessing the ordeal. In a very crucial way, my physical participation in this ritual would mean, however, that all my attention would be on the sensory experience of pain. And in that sense, it would be a little more than a kind of empirical misdirection. If I wanted to understand panata, which is the promise that motivates crucifixion, if I wanted to understand damay, which is the act of empathy, which is expressed in crucifixion, if that was my objective, then the sensation of excruciating pain would distract from that. In effect, I would be reduced to a kind of inwardly sensual ethnographic ethnographic instrument. And as I described in my part of the paper, I would be nailed to the cross, but I would miss the point. So that's what I meant by that idea of the vagaries of participant observation, that sometimes the pursuit of ethnographic accuracy might not necessarily be conducive to the acquisition of ethnographic knowledge. Okay, that's the first point. So after that, sabi sa akin, o sige, wag ka na lang magpapako. But I have a role for you in the play, right? The role was, o sige, ikaw na lang si Judas. I didn't know how to react to that. Actually, my first instinct was, yes, of course, definitely. It would enable me access to the play. It would enable me to have some kind of intersubjective relationship with those in the play, and frankly, it is quite an honor to be asked to be included in the play. But I also knew that there were various news reports and a lot of chismis that whoever plays Judas will eventually end up in an untimely death. It's either magkasakit or mamatay. That's the rumor that was going around. So I had some hesitations, but nevertheless, I was still willing to go through it. Then the following day, nakakuha ako ng text. Text siya, sabi niya, okay, hindi ka na lang si Judas, ikaw na lang si San Juan, right? St. John the Beloved. Now, you may well be familiar with St. John the Beloved. He is identified as the exemplary witness to Christ's crucifixion. Okay, he was present when all the other disciples had dispersed upon Jesus' arrest. So for me, there was a really delectable congruity between the biblical and the ethnographic persona, right? St. John is the exemplary witness. Me personifying St. John in the play would then position me as the exemplary ethnographic instrument. It was irresistible in that sense. Okay, so I definitely accepted it. The other reason was you wouldn't have to have much lines, because of course the Passion is performed in Kapampangan, and it's obviously less challenging for me if I didn't have to personify any lines. So let me read from that section. As San Juan, I was cast as the quintessential witness in a way that enabled an embodied appreciation of the physical and emotional aspects of ritual performance. In the course of the embodiment of the San Juan role, it reiterated the crucial influence of being objectified by the gaze of the crowd in the formation of religious subjectivity. Yet being San Juan also presented unexpected awkward insights that were not part of the research design. In other words, personifying San Juan enabled me to access certain things about what it means to be part of the Passion play that I could not have experienced had I taken up the ethnographic ideal of objective disconnection or dispassionate observation. So, the point about ethnographic objectivity was brought into problematization in the embodiment of the San Juan rule. So I won't say too much more about that because I describe it fully in the article. Suffice it to say that embodying San Juan placed me also in a very awkward position in many ways because of the way people then personified me. If you try to imagine being the gaze of the subject of the gaze of thousands of people, all of whom want a photograph with you, that opens up a new kind of empirical vista in the analysis of ritual in Filipino Catholicism. So yun lang naman ang points namin. To just try to depict the vagaries of ethnographic participant observation. And I hope that you will derive some meaning from that, because it was certainly something that taught us a lot about the assumptions that we as anthropologists have. So thank you very much.
I hope I didn't go over that. Wonderful. I hope that the four presentations have more or less given you a glimpse of the diversity of the disciplines represented in this journal issue, special issue, the depth and the cutting edgeness, of the materials and the thinking that we propose in this special issue. I want to thank once again the editorial team, including Mike Pante, who's our associate editor, and Professor June Aguilar as our main editor. I want to thank also the reviewers. All these papers, I must say, underwent severe critical reviewing, peer review process. That's why it took 2 years. Ping pong, back and forth, rejection here and there, and which is why I think the papers we have today are really very strong. And finally, I want to thank Rappler for partnering with us and making this event and this launch really, really accessible and possible for the wider public to see. At this point in time, we will call for a 5-minute intermission, just for 5 minutes, just for us to take a breather and to prepare our panelists for the open forum. Thank you. 5 minutes.